All right. My name is Sharon Byrne, and I'm the Executive Director of the Women's Liberation Front. We're a U.S.-based organization. I'll tell you a little about what we do, but today we're going to talk about sexual exploitation of females and how it is going to be, we have to get rid of it in order for women to achieve full equality. I think we've all tried many ways to accept it, but I think I've come to the place where no, it's got to go. So let's talk about it. So the Women's Liberation Front's mission is to restore, protect, and advance the rights of women and girls. And we use three main tools to do that. We use lots of tools, but these are the big three. We make legal arguments in court. We do policy advocacy where we advocate for legislation that advances women and girls' rights. And we do a lot of public education events like this one and others. So our philosophy is that women are oppressed by something called the patriarchy. This is not new for any of you. That gender is a hierarchical caste system that organizes male supremacy, and it cannot be reformed. It just needs to be abolished. We have unwavering support of single-sex spaces. Male violence is a pattern, and we'd love to get rid of it. And we'd like to abolish prostitution, pornography, and surrogacy. And we support women's reproductive rights and to be free of any and all coercion on this subject. Today's conversation is going to be around abolishing prostitution, pornography, and surrogacy. So for us, that rolls up into commercial sexual exploitation of women, and it is one of our main target areas of focus. And we've been pretty good with some legislation in this area recently. So I was reminded yesterday, or maybe 2 days ago, in the special rapporteur on violence against women and girls section, that there was this sort of heyday of women's rights in the 1990s. Now, I lived through the 1990s. I don't remember it being this particularly great, but now when I look back on some of the accomplishments, it really was sort of the zenith, if you will, of women's rights. So it was the Beijing Conference in 1995, right, where Hillary Clinton famously declared and borrowed from someone else, human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. It's also actually when the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls was officially established. It was in the same decade. So that's now 30 years old. We were seeing a lot more participation by women in the labor force, and we were seeing very favorable, especially in the United States, changes in employment laws such as outlawing sexual harassment in the workplace. There were a lot of girl power themes in that particular decade. You sort of couldn't go into any girls' clothing store and not see girl power on t-shirts, which was actually pretty cool. A lot of the girls' TV shows featured that theme. And there was a feeling at that time that internet was going to be the best thing ever. It was going to connect up the world, and it was going to just reduce a lot of problems of inequality and fix a lot of problems for women's rights. If you saw the movie Barbie, right, where they claimed to have solved the problems of feminism, this decade kind of felt like that. But, movements can decline, and so there's sort of four stages of social movements, and the first stage is emergence, and I would say that the suffragettes in the 1920s, 1910s and 20s really were the emergence of really the push for women's rights, and even way back then they were calling for women's equality. They didn't just want the right to vote, they wanted equality as well. And then you have sort of a coalescence stage when everybody starts coming together and really starts feeling, the energy and wanting to protest and wanting to really defend human rights. And then you move to the next stage, which is bureaucratization. And at this stage, the interest and the enthusiasm starts to wane because now we have to get down to the hard work of making this institutional, creating procedures and policy. It's a lot less sexy and glamorous than marching, right, and causing protests. But it's the hard, heavy lift of how we get women's rights, sort of really entrenched and institutionalized. And then you move to stage 4, which is decline. And this is a very transitional place. It doesn't have to be permanent, though if you ask the women in Afghanistan and Iran, decline feels like a very, very long time, right? 50 plus years at this point. And it's when groups experience, kind of co-opting by other groups, right? Where there's kind of some failures that start happening. And at this point, the social movements, socio-political, national, or intentional stance may diminish. And I would say this is where we are for women's rights. We are in a decline. We are in some places rapid decline, including in my own country here in the United States. Our UN Secretary General last year at the opening of CSW68 said that legal equality for women could take 300 years at the current pace that we are going, and that we are seeing a backlash rise against women's rights. This year, at the opening speech of CSW68, he said, Many women and girls are facing a war on their fundamental rights at home and in their communities. We cannot accept a world in which grandmothers fear that their granddaughters will enjoy fewer rights than they had. I would say in the United States, many of us that are mothers are already feeling that our daughters are now going to enjoy less rights than we did, which is it's an incredible thing to say. But women's rights really is a question of power. It's not just about rights, it's about what do you do with those rights. And it's also a question of power. So President Sanchez, in the early part of last year, after signing a law that required 40% women in government and on all corporate boards in Spain. Right after he passed that law, he got asked by a journalist, why'd you do this? Why did you think this was so important that you needed to pass a law to achieve this? And he said, women are half the population. Of course, they must share equally in the wealth and the power. When have you heard politicians say that? I mean, our US president won't even say that, right? Like, when have you ever heard a politician say those words? In yesterday's town hall meeting, Secretary Guterres said that tradition is being used as a reason to roll back women's rights, that we want to go back to traditional roles. And his feeling is it should stay where it belongs. Tradition should stay in the past. It should not be a reason d'etre in the present. We're also seeing rising authoritarianism and an increasing sense of impunity. So countries are doing things, they're passing egregious laws or invading other countries. And once upon a time, the two superpowers kind of kept that in check. But with both superpowers being a bit on the decline, that has gone. And there's a sense of impunity now that you can do whatever you want and no one can stop you. And one of the first things countries seem to want to do when they're going authoritarian is to start repressing women. I don't know why we're the first targets, but we often are. So we look at the rollback, right? So the obvious ones, right? Afghanistan and Iran, where we're seeing erasure of women, right? Just absolute erasure from public life, repression and violence. But in the Hispanosphere, we have seen a lot of femicide and violence and a lack of access to economic power. I've been watching several Spanish-speaking countries around the world standing together in solidarity to push on this front, and it's been pretty impressive to see them do it. In the United States, we've had a loss of reproductive rights at the country level. We also have Project 2025. Have you heard of Project 2025, anyone, US citizens? Yeah, so I just did a presentation on this at a women's conference last weekend for the Women's Liberation Front. It has been put together by the Heritage Foundation here in the United States that also wrote a lot of the playbook for Ronald Reagan's first term back in the 80s. So they've been at this game a very long time. And basically what they want to do is concentrate power under the hands of the president in this country, and they want to staff the administration with loyalists to the president. What does that sound like a recipe for, by the way? What is that? When have you seen that model before? Dictatorship, right? That's a dictatorship. That's absolutely trying to create a dictatorship. And part of what Project 2025 seeks to do is surveil women, further curtail their rights, end no-fault divorce, and there have also been calls for repeal of the 19th Amendment, which gave women in this country the right to vote. So that's Project 2025, and that is the first 180 days of the next conservative administration, which they believe will start in January of 2025, and as they plan to create a dictatorial presidency. So we're already seeing some states now passing some of the laws called for in Project 2025, and we've been pushing back on those as they've been happening, but I'm looking at you, Texas, Oklahoma, right? I mean, there have been quite a few already that have started. The other thing that's happening in the United States, though, is erasure of women by gender ideology. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, because in the Anglosphere, we're seeing a lot of that. UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, we're seeing an introduction of very dehumanizing language towards women, and that outside the United States in the Anglosphere, those women don't have free speech, First Amendment rights to be able to protest and say things. So when they do protest, those are being turned into hate crimes. They're being actually punished for speaking the truth. So just yesterday, the Canadian Supreme Court rendered a decision in a rape case that the woman who was raped should not be called a woman. She should be known as a person with a vagina. So this is that kind of dehumanizing language, and our feeling at Women's Liberation Front is if you can't name us, you can't defend our rights in law. So we need that term, woman, we really need it in order to be able to claim human rights and to be able to defend those in the law. So how does the sex trade, because my premise here is that, sex trade, commercial sexual exploitation is going to be a problem for women's rights, continues to be a problem for women's rights. So how does it play here? Well, there's an assumption that we always make in prostitution, and I had this challenge recently when I was in Amsterdam, and that is that it is a willing buyer who meets a willing seller. That's the assumption that's made. Yes, oldest trade in the world, all of that. But in truth, it's a form of violence against women. It's economic violence. It's economic violence against women. And it's violence because it's an economic vulnerability that creates a force that drives women into sex work. It's not work that they would otherwise do. So if a woman's vulnerable and in the sex trade, can she actually really give consent? The buyer is paying for sex acts that a woman would not otherwise willingly provide. So she's doing this for money. She needs the money, and the buyer and the seller are not in an equal relationship here, so the consent is constrained. It's not freely given. And non-compliance, if she decides not to consent, she risks violence, loss of payment, bad reviews online, believe it or not, that does happen, and further economic violation. So prostitution changes consent to mean something that can be bought, sold, and coerced. That is the difference between prostitution and any kind of women's rights. This is now a coerced relationship. This has profound social consequences for women. It reduces our status because it's predicated on the prioritization of men's desires and women's submission to them. It positions women as second class or even subhuman. So in my estimation, and in Wolf's estimation, this hurts women's rights, right? That this is not a regular job, that prostitutes are almost 10 times more likely to be killed than soldiers in combat. There's literally no category of work where the homicide rate is high as prostitution. So this should tip us all off that this is not work, but in fact a form of socially sanctioned violence. Please come in, make yourselves comfortable, have a seat. Since there is no equal footing between the buyer and the seller, prostitution starts from a place of disadvantage in the transaction. And consent is constrained or coerced, and there's serious danger involved. So in my opinion, none of this advances the cause of women's rights at all. If anything, this can further restricts and hurts women because it is a form of economic violence against women. So coming up this year, actually on June 2nd, this is an International Day of Remembrance for women who died in prostitution. And so it is an important moment to mark that there are women out there who are forced into this and then who are then killed. To achieve equality, women must have equal access to wealth and power, as President Sanchez of Spain said. We 100% agree with him. Prostitution does not deliver any access to wealth or power, so it prevents women's equality. It actually thwarts it. Let's talk a little about prostitution and sex trafficking, because these two are quite closely related and often mistaken for one another. That image you see there of Gold Spa is in Atlanta, and in 2021, a male who was enraged over his inability to handle his need for sex went into that spa, opened fire, and killed 5 women. Now, there was big consternation in the news afterwards of were those women actually prostitutes or were they sex trafficking victims? And there was tremendous confusion in the population as to what was the difference between these two. That isn't prostitution the same thing as sex trafficking? No. So again, we always think there's a willing seller involved in prostitution, but in sex trafficking, there's absolutely no willingness, right? That typically when you have been pushed into sex trafficking, your documents have been taken if you ever had them. You're forced to work off a debt or to get a visa or a green card, food and basic shelter. Those are involved in sex trafficking. And in the United States, we have a term for it called Romeo pimping, right? Where sometimes a woman will go with a man that she thinks is her boyfriend, who eventually forces her into the sex trade and starts further and further constraining her so that she cannot leave the situation. So human traffickers leverage this perception of a willing buyer and a willing seller, and they open prostitution fronts where you think all the women involved are willing sellers. But they are not. They are actually slaves. And in some of these places, I don't know if you can see it from where you are, but there's a little website down here called Rub Maps. Have you ever heard of it? Yeah, I wouldn't think y'all would have much need to go look at it. So basically it's a place where male buyers of sex in massage parlors in the United States can go look up those massage parlors and look up the girls working in them, rate them on the sex act that they perform, and recommend them to others without ever once stopping to ask, is the girl involved? even willing? Is she even remotely willing to be in this situation? The assumption is that this is a willing seller. And this is exactly what human traffickers rely on. They rely on you not to ask too many questions. And so typically what happens, you go in for your massage, and then the girl, who can barely speak English, will ask you, do you want happy ending? And if you want happy ending, that means you get a sex act, and you pay a little extra for that. So the way that this works is that they push a lot of foreign nationals into this, but also locals as well. And typically, you're coming into this because you are fleeing poverty, you're fleeing conflict situations, political upheaval, or sometimes you're fleeing a very bad domestic situation if you're a local. Sex traffic is used to supply coerced prostitutions, not willing sellers. And why do they do it? Because you can make a lot of money. A lot of money. You can sell a woman over and over and over again. What they do in the United States is, and same in Great Britain actually, they move them around so that the girls never learn any locals' names or make any connections or see a road sign or figure out where they are. They just move them from place to place to place, keep them permanently displaced and disoriented. They force them to live on site, and they're never allowed to leave. Where I live in California, there was one that was open 24 hours. Who needs a massage at 2 a.m. With the neon lights and the blacked out windows and all of that? The Mexican restaurant next door knew that it was a problem. They saw the clientele going in. They saw no women ever going in there. And they also saw no women leaving the building. This wasn't some job where you could just get off at lunch or go get your nails done. You didn't leave the building. A fire broke out there at 10 o'clock at night. And when the fire department came to put it out, they said, yeah, it was a cooking fire. Cooking fire in a massage parlor at 10 o'clock at night. Who cooks in a massage parlor at 10 o'clock at night? Women who need to eat and who also can't leave, right? So we see quite a bit of this in the United States, and it's been quite the scourge. But it is what it, it's very hard to get enforcement engaged, and I'll tell you why. And when enforcement does come, the man or woman who's manning the front door will usually say, oh, I didn't know they were offering happy endings. I didn't know they were doing sex acts. And then the prostitute is targeted, the victim in this case, the surviving, trafficking victim is the one who's targeted. So while prostitution exists, traffickers will absolutely capitalize on it and force women into it. Absolutely. This is their mode of operation. Porn is also linked into this, unfortunately. One of the things that porn has done, especially over the last 20 years, it has changed. The bodies of the porn actors have become very surgically altered. Those are now perceived to be normal bodies by viewers watching. In other words, that is what they want their women to look like, and they're very surprised when we don't look like that. But they want surgery for us to start looking like that. They want very pornified bodies. Those are now the standard. What happens in porn films these days, much more than it used to, is that violence against women and girls is very much normalized. What you also don't know when you're watching porn is that you might be watching somebody's rape video. You might be watching, see, the other thing that's happened with porn, it's gone very global, and now everyone's a producer, right? And so people will film rapes, they will film human trafficking videos and child molestation videos and put them up. So everyone's now a producer, and there's lots of watchers. But boys watching a lot too much porn think that this is sexual education, that this is what girls like, this is what we should be doing to girls, right? So these days in the emergency room, a lot of girls are starting to present with choke marks on their necks and tears anally, and they're also trying to understand why they don't like this. This seems to be what sex is now, and I'm supposed to like it, but I don't like it, and I don't understand why I don't like it, but you have to question where did that come from? Who set that standard? Unfortunately now, and we've done a lot of discussion of this at Wolf lately and starting to push back on it as well, is porn is now subsuming women and girls unwillingly. So you don't even have to go on camera or want to perform, right? As we just mentioned, rape videos can be up, but we also have an AI industry that has just exploded out into the open. That industry happens to be dominated by men. 10%, I used to be in the high-tech industry, and we used to see the same numbers. It's about 10% women in the AI industry. So it's being developed by men, for men, right? So who's going to use it would be men. And what we see now is what we call deep fake AI porn images, where they will put your face that they've lifted from your Instagram profile on a porn star's body and circulate that around. And these images last forever. You can't get them down. You can't get them off the internet. And so this is happening a lot to young girls in schools where their images are being circulated around. Their parents don't know what to do. Is there a law here? I don't know. What is that law? So what seems to be happening is that laws and enforcement are not able to really keep up with the deepfake AI porn, although some legislatures are just now starting to introduce this in the United States. But, right now it's runaway Wild West. And there seems to be very little that we can do to contain it. Even Spain's got a prosecutor that's trying to look at something that happened to naked minors, right? Their faces were put on bodies and distributed around and used in porn. And these were minors, right? And they didn't pose and they didn't submit, but their images have gone around. You can imagine in the Florida case, a girl went to school one day and several of her classmates were kind of looking at her sideways, pointing at their phones, looking at her, laughing. She's like, what is this? What? Happened in California as well and in Virginia. And it turned out it was a fake AI porn image. I'm sure everybody saw the Taylor Swift one, right? That went around the world kind of a thing. And she's big enough and powerful enough to get it down. But what about your average girl? Your average, just everyday normal girl who can never get rid of they might come back 20 years from now, maybe when she's running for Congress, right? And how is she going to explain that these were deep fake porn? They look really real. Early on, when some of these images were coming out, they were used in honor killings. That sometimes in the Muslim world, these would be circulated around, and then the girl's father couldn't tell the difference between a real image and a fake put together image, and it resulted in an honor killing. So this is a way in which women are being exploited without even being present for it, right? Or without even being, there's no consent here, no anything. They're just being absolutely dragged into this world without ever having once wanted to participate in it. So then I get asked sometimes by people wanting to purport that sex work is legit work. Okay, well, what about OnlyFans, right? So this has been presented as a way for women and girls to get rich, right? So you put nudes of yourself online, you run videos of yourself doing sexual acts, and you monetize it, right? This is supposed to be liberating for you. Really what this is just more imprisonment in the same system, right, of sexual repression and exploitation. It's giving you the impression that you're a free actor, but what ends up happening to you? Well, you need to compete in order to keep your views going. So you're going to watch what other women are doing, and the more bestial they get, you're probably going to have to do that too just to be able to keep up and compete. This will ruin your self-esteem and drag you pretty sideways. I don't know how good the money really is, but it's not good enough for that. And those images and videos are forever. So maybe you did this to get through law school, but it'll be with you forever. You'll never be able to get this down. And then, of course, some of the OnlyFans content creators are experiencing threat and stalking, right? So this is certainly not safe, any safer than street prostitution is. Same exact problem. You open yourself up to a crowd that already sees you as an object or thing to have things done to, and not as a human being with full inalienable rights. New one on the horizon that is taking off and getting a lot of traction is surrogacy. So like egg harvesting, this is presented as some kind of economic win for women and girls. Come on in and sell us all your eggs, or come in and let us rent your body to carry a baby. This is still renting a woman, and it's still commercial and sexual exploitation. And there's still a power imbalance. Who is it that signs up for surrogacy? It's not the Harvard lawyer, right, that's making $500,000 a year. That's not who's signing up to do surrogacy. It is poor women from often very poor countries. Right before the Ukraine war broke out, it was the #1 destination for surrogacy, right? And there have been cases, particularly in Greece, where it was very clear that some of the Ukrainian women giving birth were also not willing. They didn't leave, they weren't allowed to go anywhere, they had no freedom until they delivered that baby. And of course, trafficking moves right on into profit from it, right? Immediately human traffickers see the value in this of, hey, we can sell babies now, so this is even better. And so they absolutely move in and take it on. And you can see that there are stories about this. Also, the bottom story from the New York Times, Cambodia, surrogate mothers were pretty much abandoned by the surrogate parents and forced to raise the children that they carried as surrogates. We've also had situations where a couple of men, for example, wanted to buy a baby, and when the baby was delivered, it didn't look like either one of them, and they were upset, so they said no and declined to take the baby. This is just a really awful, bad situation. So commercial sexual exploitation thwarts women's rights and our access to increased power. It is an economic tool of oppression. It is economic violence that considers us products, objects, and therefore not human. Renting or buying us does not increase our wealth or power. It does not. It might keep us out of a desperate situation today, but it will not increase our wealth or power. And it leads to increasing misinformation and ignorance about women's bodies. Oh my God, if you really wanted to ruin your mental health, go hang around in some of the bowels of the Reddit subrooms where they talk about what they've seen in porn and how women's bodies works. Then watch the legislation being introduced and realize that we are dealing with an entire generation of men who have no idea how we function, what we might need, any of that, right? I mean, there have been egregious cases such as that stupid senator from Mississippi saying that in rape, a woman's body shuts down and she can't get pregnant. So therefore, abortion is fine to be banned. Just people saying things like that. It's just insane. And so what you see is because this information is so bad now and so much of it's coming from the porn world, that it leads to increasing abuses of women and girls. So when I look at how do we cage up women, what is it that puts us in this cage? The first thing I see is the minute you start taking away a woman's power over her own body, stripping her reproductive rights, inhibiting her access to abortion and birth control, calling personhood at conception, which then translates to woman as life support system for a fetus. When we start doing this, when we start stripping reproductive rights off of the table, this is the start of putting women in cages. Comes along with the sex trade, surrogacy, prostitution, and porn, right? This is further repressing and hurting women. And what do we know? That human trafficking loves to slide right into these three fronts and operate without you ever suspecting that it's there. But that's absolute enslavement of women. We also have dehumanizing language, such as calling us people with bonus holes. What is a woman? The whole video where we couldn't even define what a woman was anymore. People with vaginas, people who are menstruators, people who chest feed. This kind of dehumanizing language takes us out of the legal sphere and renders our status uncertain as human beings. We absolutely have to push back on this. And then, of course, we see in the Taliban example and Iranian example, absolute erasure from public life, right? And absolute repression. All of these together is what causes what I call the endarkenment. That we are moving into a time, I think, around the world of the endarkenment of women's rights. We legislate and we remove women's power. We spread ignorance about our bodies, erase us from public life, and that leads to the total exploitation and absolute control of women. And we are seeing that in so many places around the world right now, this exact same move. What's disturbing is it's also being done in the Anglosphere Western democracies. We are so not immune to this. So how do you fight the endarkenment? It's a power fight, right? This is all about power, and how do you get it? How do you keep it? And what do you do here? So these are the words of the Secretary General yesterday in the town hall. Women must take power from the patriarchy. However, power is never given. It must be taken. The women that came before us, on whose shoulders we are standing, they didn't ask politely, right? They went after this doggedly and determinedly until they got it, and we have got to do the same thing. So our first move, we feel like we have to abolish commercial sexual exploitation. That having this industry continuing to go and turning a blind eye to it, not looking at it, pretending it doesn't affect us, we now know that any of us in this room can be inserted into a porn image, right? So we don't even have to give permission. We don't even have to sign up for prostitution. We don't have to sign up for porn. It can be done to you. We have to increase personal power for women and girls, and we have to increase political power for women and girls. And our foremothers in the 70s knew how to do this. We have got to remember the things that they did. And we need international pressure to elevate rights and self-sovereignty. Self-sovereignty, meaning the ability to walk around, take care of yourself, govern yourself, have human rights. Self-sovereignty for women and girls. This is what is under threat globally at the moment. So, in getting rid of commercial sexual exploitation, any exploitation of women and girls needs to be seen as a violation of their human rights. It needs to be seen as a violation of their human rights. We must end that. No violation of women's human rights. We must recognize that women in the sex industry would not be there if there were education and opportunity doorways open to them. Again, we know the Harvard lawyer does not do the sex trade. We know that the woman who owns a successful business and has a fabulous product line does not suddenly wake up and decide to do OnlyFans. That is not how this works. It goes for women that do not have the access to the opportunities. Strip illusion that sellers are always willing, and thus empowered. We know that they are not. We know that they are not. And even a woman who is not being trafficked, but who has entered prostitution is still in a disadvantageous position of power. She is in a coerced consent mode. She does not have the kind of freedom of movement that you have when you're opening your own business. Recognize that porn is now permeating mainstream understanding of women and girls, and it is harmful to them. It is harmful to women and girls. We would also like to outlaw surrogacy. And one of the ways to go around with prostitution and porn that we have seen be very effective is to attack the demand side. This is typically called the equality model or the Nordic model. This does not punish women in the prostitution trade, but actually punishes their buyers. There's mixed evidence as to whether or not this is really successful. It's early in the experiment, about 10 years in, not convinced that it's 1,000% successful. But we have seen some things that do work. For example, some law enforcement agencies have taken to shaming buyers. So they will set up a sting in a hotel. They will have a cop pose as a prostitute, have a John come to the hotel, not only arrest the John, but have his car towed so that he has to come and get it out of impoundment after he's finished processing himself out of the jail, and explain to maybe his wife or significant other why he had to have the car get out of impoundment, right? So there is some good things to be said about outing buyers and outing and shaming buyers of sex. In the United States, we've been pushing on something called age verification laws for porn. We've seen this be very effective. So, for example, Louisiana was the first state to pass this in the United States. Basically, what it makes you do is when you go to Pornhub, which is known to be a site that hosts rape videos, trafficking videos, child sex videos. It's so egregious. It's a privately owned company called MindGeek out of Canada. They've been sued multiple times. So what we see in the United States is when they pass the Louisiana age verification bill, it requires you to verify that you are 18 or over before accessing the porn site. And the way that it does this is it directs you through the Louisiana DMV, which means you have to verify your driver's license information that you receive from the government before you can access Pornhub site. Pornhub themselves reported on X that this dropped traffic from Louisiana to their site by 80%. That porn users were afraid that the Louisiana DMV might be tracking them and that police might one day want that information for some kind of investigation. So it had a very chilling effect on porn. Pornhub lost their case against the state of Texas for passing the same law just last Friday. They lost in court, and they have shut down all access to Pornhub from Texas. Cannot even get to that site anymore. So there are ways to really push back and knock holes in the wall of the porn industry. Is this perfect? No. But sometimes we have to like the good enough legislation where we can at least get a toehold and start kicking down that wall. Eventually we'll get it to crumble all the way, but we have to start. I will tell you that there are 20 states now looking at passing porn age verification laws. See me after if you want to know if your state's one of them. The other thing that we think is very effective is since the tech platforms introduced all this crap, why not litigate against them, right? So there are multiple states here in the United States and the EU that have signed on to suing Meta, the maker of Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram. So, and then we've also seen the Attorney General of New Mexico has filed a lawsuit against Instagram and Facebook for serving up porn to minors and for introducing them straight into pedophile ranks when the child has expressed no interest in seeing any of that material. So the tech platforms unleash it, then we should litigate it. And in this country, we're very good at litigation, and it tends to produce very good effects. So how do we increase personal power for women and girls? Because this is the other part of this equation, right? So we have to recognize women as sovereign beings with inalienable human rights in law. And I would say that most of us around the world thought we had done that right up to about yesterday. And then when these things started getting chipped away and taken from us, and the word woman is not even allowed to be discussed anymore, we suddenly found we were standing on very thin ice. And we need to be able to do things to bolster that word into law. Couple of ways to do that, right? So we've seen the president of Spain. I love talking about him because he's my favorite in terms of passing just a wave of women's rights legislation. He hired a minister of equality. This has been done in some other countries too. They pushed through a raft of legislation. They've gotten a lot of backlash for it, but things like mandating that women be 40% of corporate board makeup and also of the government. It forced the political parties to start recruiting female candidates early in the process. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but men will often wake up and say, oh, the world's going to hell, I think I need to run for office. Women will say, the world's going to hell, and I'd like to run for office, but I think I need 3 more degrees and to serve on 2 boards and commissions and maybe a couple of more qualifications. We have to shove women into running. So by mandating that the government achieves parity, and parity means somewhere between 40 and 60% representation in your government as women. By mandating parity, it forces political parties to start recruiting much earlier and to start looking for female candidates and training them to run. I myself have been trained to run, and I've trained other female candidates to run, and I've run female candidate campaigns. It is worth it to do this. It is absolutely worth it to do this. Women should be screaming, no decisions about us without us, right? So we need to get ourselves at that table to be making some of these decisions. But we also need to provide pathways for women to access economic and educational resources. So I saw at one of the UN forums that I was in 2021, I saw various presidents get up on the stage and make financial commitments to advancing the cause of women and girls. I saw Spain make that commitment, France make that commitment, and then I saw that money as it started to flow through, where they were making microloans available to women businesses, for example, to get them started. So when nationally you make commitment to women's rights and you make commitment to advancing women's causes, we actually see the flow through of the money. And that is where all the power can be. In my hometown in Santa Barbara, California, we have something called Women's Economic Ventures. They are funded by the Small Business Administration and by donations, and they have gotten $9 million to women businesses to get them off the ground, and they have trained over 6,000 women to start their own businesses, and they'll put you through the whole thing, from your business plan to your marketing plan to projecting your revenues, all of that, so that when you decide to go and get your Small Business Administration loan to get your business started, you have everything in your hands that you need. And the course is completely free. Free. Any woman can take it, and it takes you 12 weeks, and it's 2 hours a week. So you take 1 weeknight and you go. I've been through it, other women have been through it. This is the kind of thing where if we can get women to start more businesses, start even micro businesses. In some countries, all you need is a cell phone and about $50, right? And you can be in business and starting to do things, sell things, make things. This is one of the ways that women get more access to economic power and more access to political power. We also need more access to political power. So one of the things we all need to stop doing, this is unfortunate fallout from the 90s, I suppose. A lot of companies had gender departments or a gender officer. Here we are at the Conference on the Status of Women, and what are we doing? We're meeting as women, and we're talking about women's issues, and we're talking with other women, and we're saying the things that need to be done. And then we'll all get on our planes and go home, right? What needed to happen was we needed to be inserted into the government at all levels, that no bill should get onto a floor without the question being asked, does this affect women and girls in any way? If so, it needs to be vetted. We're not going to do anything that impedes women's rights. Does this help women's rights accelerate? Does this help women economically? If it does, then let's look at moving the bill. In other words, instead of being some side thing that people go and consult with every once in a while, or we have a conference once a year, we should have been embedded into every part of policy making, law making, all of it. We should have always, even down to the city level. Certain things should not be improved in cities if it's not going to help women's safety, right? I mean, down to the curb level, down to the street light level, women needed to be involved in all stages of the decision-making process. That's kind of not happening, and we need that to happen. We would not see so many abortion bans in the United States if that was the case, if women were fully embedded in the decision-making process. We need to achieve political representation parity. I will tell you, in my home state in California, my state senator passed a law in California to require that every corporation headquartered in California have one woman on its board. One. She got a lot of flack for that law, but she also got a lot of calls from Sweden and other places saying, how the hell did you do that? And we need to do that. Because she also understood that corporate boards push products on women. They make decisions about the testing that gets done on these products. They make decisions about the design. And many of these products are targeted to women who pay a pink tax for the privilege of getting to buy something that would cost any man less, right? But you put pink on it, whoop, you can jack the price because women might need it. Most drugs that come out on the market are not tested on women. Why? Because we cycle too much trouble, too much effort. Take the short path, test everything on a 180-pound male. Cars are designed for the 180-pound male. Think about it. Think about all the things, all the products that come out that are not, they're aimed at women, we're expected to buy it, but they're really not consulting with us about those products. So that law in California to get one woman, one on a corporate board, is being overturned in court right now as we speak. We couldn't even get one. So parity on corporate boards is just as important as parity in government. That is where the power is. That's where the wealth is. Women must have access to it. I agree with the president of Spain. And I want to see that we invest in women and girls, not pay lip service to it, but that we actually do it. We also had this conversation yesterday with the Nordic countries, and that is that care work, which is unpaid and paid, right? So if you're a nurse, you're a paid care worker. If you're a mom, you're an unpaid care worker, right? That we need to see that that is counted in the gross domestic product for countries. Somebody has to do it. It's labor. If you don't do it, you have to pay somebody else to do it. So why is it not counted in the GDP? Why is it not? And why is women who traditionally fall into this field paid less than anyone else to do it, right? We have unfairly valued these things. It's one of the reasons that women are not having as many babies, and it's one of the reasons people are upset that we're not having so many babies. But it's because you expect us to attend to women's issues in business out of sight and out of mind. There's no quarter given for that. I've seen that in certain countries, maternity leave, for example, is 4 to 6 months guaranteed. Not in the United States. There is no guaranteed paid maternity leave at all. So there are things that we can do that will value and vault the value of care work, and also count it to the GDP and let women acquire more recognition for the work that they do for families, and it does fall to them to do it. It's also still kind of crappy that women are paid so much less than men, because very often when a care decision comes up in a family, the question will be put, well, whose income should suffer so that we can attend to this care issue? And typically it's the lower wage earner, and typically that is the female. So it forces women into more unpaid care work, just by the kind of capitalistic economics dynamics that we engage in. Also in fighting the undocumented and increasing political power, international, right? We're here at the United Nations. We need to look at some international things. So we need to have sanctions and pressures on countries that oppress women and girls. That needs to be, again, if we gave a damn about women and girls, that would be at the top of our list, right? Hey, are you hurting them in your country? We've got something to say about that. I don't know if you've met her, but that's Reem Al-Salam. She is the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence against Women and Girls, and she's a rock star. She's got a megaphone right now, and she is using it. And we adore her. We met with her last October at Wolf, and we have spent a lot of time talking to her. She has taken up the banner for women around the globe. She's getting a lot of flack for it, but she is not standing down. She's stronger in some ways than the one on sexual violence against women and girls. Reem has been able to come out against dehumanizing language. She's been able to come out against repression of freedom of speech for women. She's been very, very strong. We actually really like her. More like that would be good, right? Like more like that would be great, that is not afraid to use their megaphone. And then policies and discussions must consider the effects on women and girls as a priority, not as an afterthought, as a priority. And the international community is well poised to do that. So there you go. That is my presentation. If you